This is Electric Universe Eyes, and today I'm going to narrate an article posted to holoscience.com, the Electric Universe, titled Electric Gravity in an Electric Universe, posted August 22nd, 2008 by Wallace Thornhill. Quote, "If a special geometry has to be invented in order to account for a falling apple, even Newton might be appalled at the complications which would ensue when really difficult problems are tackled." End quote. By Sir Oliver Lodge, FRS 1921. Gravity is the most familiar force. We are subject to it every day of our lives. Newton gave us his, quote, law of gravity, which describes its effect but doesn't explain it. Quote, "I frame no hypotheses," he wrote. Einstein wasn't so prudent when he introduced his, quote, postulates. Unfortunately, his real geometry doesn't explain gravity either. The usual demonstration, using heavy steel balls on a rubber sheet to represent gravity wells, relies on gravity as its own explanation. The fact that we do not understand gravity in this space age should cause alarm. Our cosmology, our view of our situation in the universe, is based on a mystery. The, quote, Big Bang is a monumentally expensive work of fiction. Some history. We missed a chance to include electricity in astronomy in the early 1900s. Birkeland was performing his electrical, quote, Little Earth, or Torella, experiments in Norway, and Gauss and Weber were discovering the electrical interactions of matter. Today, physicists labor under misconceptions about the nature of matter and space, the relationship between matter, mass, and gravity, the electrical nature of stars and galaxies, and the size, history, and age of the universe. So when astrophysicists turn to particle physicists to solve their intractable problems, and particle physicists use it as an excuse for squandering billions of dollars on futile experiments, neither party recognizes that the other discipline is in a parlous state. Quote, "After all, to get the whole universe totally wrong in the face of clear evidence for over 75 years merits monumental embarrassment and should induce a modicum of humility." End quote. Quote, "The standard model of particle physics would appear to fail in nearly every possible way, and all of its failures seem to stem from the early 1930s. By all indications, science seems to have taken a wrong turn about this time. After 300 years of progressively simplifying the description of the universe, with fewer entities and simpler laws, it suddenly turned the other way, with complexity and entities multiplying like rabbits." End quote. Quote, "We are about to enter the 21st century, but our understanding of the origin of inertia, mass, and gravitation still remains what has been for centuries, an outstanding puzzle." End quote. How has this situation arisen? In the 20th century, technology perfected wireless communication and computers and got man into space, while fundamental science fell deeper into a black hole of complication, illogicality, and metaphysics. I consider the principal cause has been the usurping, since Einstein, of natural philosophy and physics by theoretical mathematicians. Meanwhile, Einstein, perhaps to his credit, remained skeptical of his own work. I have always found it instructive to read what past luminaries of science thought of a radically new idea. The free exchange of opposing opinions is later stifled by the bandwagon effect. Science, like all human endeavors, is subject to fads and fallacies. When controversy was still tolerated over Einstein's theories, Sir Oliver Lodge, a noted fellow of the Royal Society, wrote in Nature on February 17, 1921, quote, "What is really wanted for a truly natural philosophy is a supplement to Newtonian mechanics, expressed in terms of the medium which he suspected and sought after but could not attain, and introducing the additional facts, chiefly electrical, especially the fact of variable inertia, discovered since his time. If we could understand the structure of the particle in terms of the medium of which it is composed, and if we knew the structure of the rest of the medium also, so as to account for the potential stress at every point, that would be a splendid step, beyond anything accomplished yet." End quote. This is precisely the electric universe view. Natural philosophy has withered in its confrontation with the modern fashion of mathematical metaphysics and computer games. Most of the, quote, discoveries now are merely computer-generated, quote, virtual reality, black holes, dark matter, dark energy, etc. The computer models are constructed upon a shadowy kernel of ignorance. We do not understand gravity. Einstein, in his special theory of relativity, postulated there was no medium, called the ether, but Maxwell's theory of electromagnetism requires it, and Sir Oliver Lodge saw the ether as crucial to our understanding. So Einstein, at a stroke, removed any possibility that he or his followers would find a link between electromagnetism and gravity. It served the egos of his followers to consecrate Einstein's ideas and treat dissent as blasphemy. Quote, "Sometimes a concept is baffling not because it is profound, but because it is wrong." End quote. Decades later, Paul R. Hale wrote in Scientific Monthly, May 1954, quote, "The more we study gravitation, the more there grows upon us the feeling that there is something peculiarly fundamental about this phenomenon to a degree that is unequaled among other natural phenomena. Its independence of the factors that affect our phenomena and its dependence only upon mass and distance suggests that its roots avoid things superficial and go down deep into the unseen, to the very essence of matter and space." End quote. From Gravitation, Still a Mystery. This sentiment has been echoed down to the present, but few are listening. The problem has been worsened by the particle physicists who indulge in their own virtual reality, inventing, quote, virtual particles to transmit forces. If they, quote, could understand the structure of the particle in terms of the medium of which it is composed, end quote, and put flesh on the metaphysical bones of quantum theory, we should be much further advanced. Sir Oliver Lodge deserves to be heard once more. Quote, "It may be that when the structure of an electron is understood, we shall see that an even-powered stress in the surrounding ether is necessarily involved. What I do feel instinctively is that this is the direction for discovery, and what is needed is something internal and intrinsic, and that all attempts to explain gravitation as due to the action of some external agency, whether flying particles or impinging waves, are doomed to failure. For all these speculations regard the atom as a foreign substance, a sort of grit in the ether, driven hither and thither by forces alien to itself. When, some day, we understand the relation between matter and ether, I venture to predict that we shall perceive something more satisfying than that." End quote. Electric gravity. In 1850, Faraday performed experiments trying to link gravity with electromagnetism that were unsuccessful. However, his conviction remained. Quote, "The long and constant persuasion that all the forces of nature are mutually dependent, having one common origin, or rather being different manifestations of one fundamental power, has often made me think on the possibility of establishing, by experiment, a connection between gravity and electricity. No terms could exaggerate the value of the relation they would establish." End quote. Faraday's estimate of the importance of such a connection still stands. Today, there are a number of scholars pursuing this obvious line of inquiry. After all, the electrical and gravitational forces share fundamental characteristics. They both diminish with the inverse square of the distance. They are both proportional to the product of the interacting masses or changes, and both forces act along the line between them. Matter and mass. Gravity acts in proportion to the mass of an object. What do we mean when we refer to the mass of an object? Quote, "One of the most astonishing features of the history of physics is the confusion which surrounds the definition of the key term in dynamics, mass." End quote. In the 20th century, numerous textbooks equated the mass of an object to its weight. That equation led to confusion because it doesn't explain why the mass of an object we measure on a weighing machine, gravitational mass, is identical to the mass of that object when we push it, inertial mass. When it was found that atoms are composed of charged particles, there were attempts to explain mass in terms of electromagnetism. Henri Poincaré wrote in 1914, quote, "What we call mass would seem to be nothing but an appearance, and all inertia to be of electromagnetic origin." End quote. It makes good sense that the equivalence of gravitational and inertial mass should be explained by the electrical structure of matter. However, it is not the philosophical concept of mass, but its mathematical treatment that occupies physicists. Einstein's famous equation, E equals mc squared, demonstrated that mass and electromagnetic energy are directly related. But mystification resulted when the earlier concept that related mass to quantity of matter was unconsciously substituted. Textbooks and encyclopedias today slip unnoticeably into the error of using the words mass and matter interchangeably. A NASA educational website tells us that, quote, mass is a measure of how much matter a planet is made of, end quote. It shows that the confusion of mass with quantity of matter infects astrophysics. The consequences are profound for cosmology. The mass of a celestial body cannot tell us about its composition. We cannot say what the sun is made from. Another example is comet nuclei, which are electrically charged bodies. They register masses that should have them constructed like an empty sponge, yet they look like solid rock. It is their appearance, together with the recently discovered high-temperature minerals, rock particles from a comet, that give the accurate picture. Comets and asteroids are fragments of planets. They are not primordial, quite the reverse, in fact. This inexcusable philosophical muddle over matter and mass has given rise to violation of the fundamental physics principle of no creation or annihilation of matter. It has allowed a miraculous cosmological creation story to gain currency, known as the Big Bang. Notions of vacuum energy and of particles winking in and out of existence in the vacuum of space are similarly miraculous. The simple fact is that we have no concept of why matter manifests with mass. But when we apply force to a body, how is that force transferred to overcome inertia? The answer is electrically, by the repulsion between the outer electrons in the atoms closest to the points of contact. The equivalence of inertial and gravitational mass strongly suggests that the force of gravity is a manifestation of the electrical force. The origin of mass and the electrical nature of matter. Without accepting his model in its entirety, I consider Ralph Sansbury's straightforward electrical theory of magnetism and gravity to have a conceptual merit. Simply stated, all subatomic particles, including the electron, are resonant systems of orbiting smaller electric charges of opposite polarity that sum to the charge on that particle. These smaller electric charges he calls subtrons. This is the kind of simplification of particle physics required by Occam's razor, and philosophically agreeable, though it leaves unanswered the real nature and origin of the subtrons. In this model, the electron cannot be treated like a fundamental point-like particle. It must have structure to have angular momentum and a preferred magnetic orientation, known vaguely as spin. There must be orbital motion of subtrons within the electron to generate a magnetic dipole. The transfer of energy between the subtrons in their orbits within the classical electron radius must be resonant and near instantaneous for the electron to be a stable particle. The same argument applies to the proton, the neutron, and as we shall see, the neutrino. This model satisfies Einstein's views that there must be some lower level of structure in matter to cause resonant quantum effects. It is ironic that such a model requires the electric force between the charges to operate incomparably faster than the speed of light in order that the electron remain a coherent particle. It means that Einstein's special theory of relativity that prohibits signaling faster than light must be repealed. A recent experiment verifies this. Electromagnetic waves are far too slow to be the only means of signaling in an immense universe. Gravity requires the near instantaneous character of the electric force to form stable systems like our solar system and spiral galaxies. Gravitationally, the Earth sees the sun where it is this instant, not where it was more than 8 minutes ago. Newton's famous law of gravity does not refer to time. We must have a workable concept of the structure of matter that satisfies the observation that the inertial and gravitational masses of an object are equivalent. When we accelerate electrons or protons in an electromagnetic field, they become less responsive to the fields the more they are accelerated. This has been interpreted as an increase in particle mass, which is unhelpful until we understand the origin of mass. If the charged subtrons have little intrinsic mass, how do they, in combination, give the electron, proton, and neutron the property of mass? An electric field will transversely squash the subtron orbits within an electron or proton. If you cause acceleration at one point in a circular orbit and a deceleration at the diametrically opposite point of the orbit, the result is an elliptical orbit. In the case of an accelerated particle, the orbit will tend to flatten in the direction of the applied force. It seems that as more energy is supplied to accelerate the particle, the more that energy is assimilated inelastically in further distortion rather than in acceleration. In other words, the electric force becomes less effective at acceleration, which Einstein would have us interpret as an increase in mass. For comparison, Weber's classical approach to the problem has, quote, a decrease in the electrical force and not a change in the inertial mass, end quote. This model implies that the charge centers of a proton at rest are more separated than those in an electron at rest. That allows the proton to distort more readily than an electron in the same electric field and may account for their classical differences in size and mass. Quote, the advantage of this interpretation of the conversion of mass into energy and vice versa is that we are not forced to accept the increase of mass to infinity as a moving mass approaches the speed of light, end quote. What is gravity? Gravity is due to radially oriented electrostatic dipoles inside the Earth's protons, neutrons, and electrons. The force between any two aligned electrostatic dipoles varies inversely as the fourth power of the distance between them and the combined force of similarly aligned electrostatic dipoles over a given surface is squared. The result is that the dipole-dipole force, which varies inversely as the fourth power between collinear dipoles, becomes the familiar inverse square force of gravity for extended bodies. The gravitational and inertial response of matter can be seen to be due to an identical cause. The puzzling extreme weakness of gravity, 1,000 trillion times less than the electrostatic force, is a measure of the minute distortion of subatomic particles in a gravitational field. The 2,000-fold difference in mass of the proton and neutron in the nucleus versus the electron means that gravity will maintain charge polarization by offsetting the nucleus within each atom, as shown. The mass of a body is an electrical variable, just like a proton in a particle accelerator. Therefore, the so-called gravitational constant, or G, with the peculiar dimension L3/mt2 is a variable. That is why G is so difficult to pin down. Anti-gravity? Conducting metals will shield electric fields. However, the lack of movement of electrons in response to gravity explains why we cannot shield against gravity by simply standing on a metal sheet. As an electrical engineer wrote, quote, we don't have to worry about gravity affecting the electrons inside the wire leading to our coffee pot, end quote. If gravity is an electric dipole force between subatomic particles, it is clear that the force daisy chains through matter regardless of whether it is conducting or non-conducting, Sansbury explains. Quote, electrostatic dipoles within all atomic nuclei are very small but all have a common orientation. Hence their effect on a conductive piece of metal is less to pull the free electrons in the metal to one side toward the center of the Earth, but to equally attract the similarly oriented electrostatic dipoles inside the nuclei and free electrons of the conductive piece of metal, end quote. This offers a clue to the reported gravity shielding effects of a spinning superconducting disk. Electrons in a superconductor exhibit a connectedness, which means that their inertia is increased. Anything that interferes with the ability of the subatomic particles within the spinning disk to align their gravitationally induced dipoles with those of the Earth will exhibit anti-gravity effects. Despite a number of experiments demonstrating anti-gravity effects, no one has been able to convince scientists attached to general relativity that they have been able to modify gravity. This seems to be a case of turning a blind eye to unwelcome evidence. Support for anti-gravity implicitly undermines Einstein's theory. Quote, instantaneous gravity. A significant fact, usually overlooked, is that Newton's law of gravity does not involve time. This raises problems for any conventional application of electromagnetic theory to the gravitational force between two bodies in space. Since electromagnetic signals are restricted to the speed of light, gravity must act instantly for the planets to orbit the sun in a stable fashion. If the Earth were attracted to where the sun appears in the sky, it would be orbiting a large empty space because the sun moves on it in the 8.3 minutes it takes for sunlight to reach the Earth. If gravity operated at the speed of light, all planets would experience a torque that would sling them out of the solar system in a few thousand years. Clearly, that doesn't happen. This supports the view that the electric force operates at a near infinite speed on our cosmic scale, as it must inside the electron. It is a significant simplification of all of our torturous theorizing that has gone into the nature of gravity and mass. Einstein's postulates are wrong. Matter has no effect on empty space. Space is three-dimensional, something our senses tell us. There is a universal clock, so time travel and variable aging is impossible, something that common sense has always told us. But most important, the universe is connected and coherent. The real nature of light. However, it leaves the question of what the speed of light means. This is where I part company with Sansbury and others who explain it in terms of a delayed response to an instantaneous signal. In my view, the crucial difference between the near infinite speed of the electric force and the relative dawdle of light on any cosmic scale is that the electric force is longitudinal, while light is an oscillating transverse signal moving slowly through a medium. If I can use a simple analogy, light travels slowly with the transverse ripples on a pond surface. Gravity travels swiftly and longitudinally, like the speed of sound in water. Once again, this is at odds with Einstein's metaphysics because it reinstates Maxwell's ether. Maxwell's electromagnetic theory requires a medium. How can you wave nothing? The Michael Morley basement experiment was heralded as having lain to rest the notion of an ether. It didn't. Dayton Miller carried out far more rigorous repeats of that experiment at different locations and elevations. He found a residual, which allowed him to conclude that ponderable bodies like the Earth drag the ether with them. He was able to determine the relative motion of the solar system with respect to the ether. Others and I have argued that a plenum of neutrinos forms the ether. Based upon nuclear experiments, I have also proposed that neutrinos are the most collapsed, lowest energy state of matter. In other words, they exhibit vanishingly small mass. However, being normal matter composed of subtrons, they are capable of forming electric dipoles. In an oscillating electromagnetic field, a neutrino must rotate through 360 degrees per cycle. That would link the speed of light in a vacuum to the moment of inertia of a neutrino. Having some mass, neutrinos must be dragged along by gravitating bodies. They form a kind of extended atmosphere which will bend light. It has nothing to do with the metaphysical warping of space. The electric universe. The confusion about any role for electricity in celestial dynamics has come about because of our ignorance of the electrical nature of matter and of gravity. The classical signposts to an understanding of gravity were in place at the beginning of the 20th century, but after the terrible world wars, it seems people were looking for heroes with a new vision. Einstein became an overnight idol of genius, and his geometric metaphysics the new fashion in science. The dedication to the Einstein myth has become so entrenched that to say, quote, "the emperor has no clothes," invites ridicule. But over almost a century, there has been an astronomical price to pay for unquestioning adherence to dogma. A recent review of the history of astronomy concludes, quote, "The inability of researchers to rid themselves of earlier ideas led to centuries of stagnation. An incredible series of deliberate oversights, indefensible verbal evasions, myopia, and plain pig-headedness characterize the pedestrian progress along this elusive road for science. We must be constantly on our guard, critically examining all the hidden assumptions in our work." End quote. Since scientists have demonstrated their inability to do this, the public must be made aware how science actually operates and is protected from scrutiny. It will require the kind of fearless investigative journalism we often see in politics. Unfortunately, science reporters are part of the problem if they bow to the experts and the lazy dissemination of academic propaganda. Ultimately, cosmology must have no loose ends. The electric universe model is an attempt to connect many strands of knowledge. Quote, "Proposals that eventually pan out in the world are far more likely to exhibit narrative consistency, perhaps what Edward O. Wilson calls consilience in his book of that name." End quote. Quote, "The goal of consilience is to achieve progressive unification of all strands of knowledge in service to the indefinite betterment of the human condition." End quote. No matter that, there is an avalanche of books and papers supporting Big Bang cosmology. Repetition provides no assurance that one particular interpretation of results is valid. Quote, Assurance of interpretation can come only by comparing the success of competing hypotheses in interpreting data from disparate areas." End quote. Big Bang cosmology fails this test because it brooks no competition. For example, plasma cosmology is officially recognized by the largest professional organization in the world, the Institute of Electrical and Electronic Engineers, or IEEE, while Big Bang cosmologists ignore it. The electric universe model is an extension of plasma cosmology. It is based on concepts derived from observations as disparate as petroglyphs in quasar redshift. Big Bang cosmologists have no narrative that can compete. But by the simple act of ignoring alternatives, they reject them. If the public simply acquiesce and do not speak up. This was written by Thornhill. For more information, please visit hollowscience.com.